energy in the room, everybody. Guys, we are going to get started with this evening's proceedings. My name's Micheal Noetel. I'm an academic at the University of Queensland, and tonight I guess I'm wearing my hat as the chair of Effective Altruism Australia. And I want to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners and acknowledge their custodianship of the land on which we're meeting today. So on behalf of the whole conference organising committee, pay our respects to ancestors and descendants who continue their cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So again, I really want to welcome everybody to Effective Altruism EAGxAustralia for 2023. And I'm so happy to see so many new and familiar faces. I love this conference. I'm really happy you're all here. And I think by being here tonight, you've already demonstrated so many of the values that we hold dear within the Effective Altruism community. You're showing a commitment to others. You're here because you want to have an impact on the world. You want to learn new ways of trying to do that better. You're all gladly giving up your Friday night. Many of you are giving up your entire weekend. And some of us, myself included, look forward to this weekend the entire year. But this isn't a weekend at the vineyards. This is a weekend of beating around ideas with reason and evidence, with a scientific mindset. It's about trying to find ways that we might be wrong. It's about learning from others and from evidence and being open to new ways of thinking. And I think this openness is something that sets our community apart, both in the way that we treat people and the way that we treat ideas. I think we try to make this a community that's welcoming to everybody. One of the key ways that we do that is being open to new perspectives. We're all just trying to do as much good as we can. And if it looks like there might be a better way of doing it, I think we're unusually good at changing what we think and what we do. I also think we're really aware of how important it is to align what we think and what we do. And in other fields, this isn't always the case. According to ChatGPT, 30% of financial advisors don't have a retirement plan, 45% of teachers say they don't spend enough time learning, and 50% of psychologists like me say we have clinically significant stress. In contrast, I've never met a group of people who spend so much time and money for the greater good, who make so many personal sacrifices for the good of others. So as one example, almost 10,000 people have now signed the Giving What We Can pledge to donate 10% of their income until they retire. Now, of course, every group has its exceptions, but I think you do a wonderful job of being the change that we want in the world. I look up to so many of you as role models, and you make me want to be better myself. And as a place to want to be better and to learn to be better, there's no place I'd rather be than here. The Effective Altruism community has been one of the most warm, supportive and helpful environments I've been lucky enough to be a part of. So some circles are famous for their tall poppy syndrome, but this community grows amazing people rather than cutting them down. We're all just trying to make the world a better, safer place. And we know we can do good better when we do it together. So to those ends, please make the most of tonight to live these values. Connect with new ideas, but also with new people. And for those of you attending the rest of the conference, make sure that you use Swapcard to connect with people, create some one-on-one, spend tonight finding people that you want to meet, and really try to, expose yourself to some new people that you haven't met before. So that will help you make the most of this weekend. And very briefly, speaking of which, we would not be able to have this conference in this weekend without the conference organising committee. So while I'm chair of EAGxAustralia, the charity, we can't take credit for this. This is a community-driven conference. So I'm really grateful for those of you in the organising committee, especially James and Vanessa, who led the group with so much enthusiasm and dedication. So can you please give them a round of applause? When I started thinking and learning about effective altruism, I thought it was all bed nets and basic income. As I learned more, I realised that my donations were only a part of how we can tackle the world's most pressing problems. Governments are so important for tackling these problems too. And at one point, I thought that changing policy was intractable, that governments were too big or lumbering to move to solve pressing problems that we need solved. But our guests tonight have shown that's not the case. The 4 guests we've lined up have all shown that you can use science and reason to improve public policy. I hope they inspire you to do the same. For our first guest, the least I can say about him is that he's been an inspiration to me. Andrew Leigh has a PhD in public policy from Harvard, making him one of the elite Australian MPs who can explain what a p-value is. He was a professor of economics at the Australian National University, and he's written 10 books, including What's the Worst That Can Happen? Existential Risk and Extreme Politics. On Twitter this year, he wrote, "Our government has a goal of doubling philanthropy by 2030, and we need to see more effective altruism." So he's been a very public advocate of our cause and the things that we are trying to do. On top of that, he can run a marathon under 3 hours. He has his own podcast and 3 gorgeous kids, all while managing the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities, Treasury and Employment. So please welcome Australia's very own Aligned Superintelligence, the Honourable Dr. Andrew Leigh.
Thank you, Mike, for a most generous introduction. It is an absolute treat to be with you this evening. Can I acknowledge too that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Kulin people and pay respect to their elders past and present. I acknowledge all Indigenous people in the room and commit myself to the implementation in full of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which starts with voting yes on October 14th. Thank you for the chance to speak about these big, weighty and important topics. Through the course of this week, I've had the chance to give talks in different parts of Australia on competition policy, on small business, on randomised trials, on community building. All of those are important, but the topic of effective altruism and the slice of it that I'm going to focus on tonight, catastrophic risk, is perhaps just that little bit bigger. Politicians don't often talk about the chance of the world ending, but if you believe Oxford's Toby Ord, that chance over the next century is 1 in 6. Too often we can confuse the improbable with the impossible. We can think that just because something isn't likely to happen, it isn't going to happen. But what catastrophic risk reminds us is that if you sprint across the road just once, chances are you'll get to the other side without being hit by a car. If you sprint across the road every day, then eventually something bad is likely to happen. Over the course of the next century, if we believe Toby, that risk of 1 in 6 is comprised largely of factors that are driven by humanity. They're anthropogenic risks rather than naturally occurring risks. And I want to talk a bit tonight about what I'll call the 4 horsemen, the 4 biggest risks that pose a chance to humanity's future. If that chance is 1 in 6, then it's a bit like humanity is playing Russian roulette. 6 chambers, 1 bullet. Even the most foolhardy soldier generally steers clear of a game of Russian roulette. You wouldn't get on a plane that had a 1 in 6 chance of crashing. You wouldn't take a walk with your eyes closed if you thought there was a 1 in 6 chance you wouldn't get back. You wouldn't have come into this lecture hall tonight if you thought there was a 1 in 6 chance you wouldn't get to leave it. And that's just the chance over the course of the next century. If we keep on playing this if humanity keeps on playing this game of Russian roulette once a century, then the odds of getting to the year 3000 unscathed go down to just 1 in 6 themselves. There's a 5 in 6 chance that humanity doesn't make it through the next millennium. So what are these big risks we've been talking about, these 4 horsemen? Well, the one to start off with is catastrophic climate change. We think a lot about the ways in which climate change could make the world worse, but there's also the potential of feedback loops, such as the melting of the Greenland ice sheet or catastrophic feedback loops in the Amazon that could cause sea level rises that result in the ending of humanity. The second big risk comes from nuclear war. We know from a lot of information that's being released now that the Cold War saw a tremendous series of near misses, moments in which a detection system arced up thinking that it was seeing incoming missiles, when in fact it was a weather satellite. Moments during the Cuban Missile Crisis on which just a single commander's decision prevented nuclear weapons from being launched. We know there that the risk of nuclear catastrophe is large and potentially gets larger with more nuclear weapons states. The third horseman is the danger of an artificially engineered pandemic. COVID was bad, but the greatest risk lies in genetic engineering techniques that could allow someone to engage in what's called gain-of-function research and create a bug that is as contagious as measles, but as deadly as Ebola. This potential lies in the fact that the technology is advancing faster than the security systems around it. And the fourth risk is unaligned artificial intelligence. The danger that artificial intelligence it reaches a capacity where it outstrips humans, but it has goals which are not aligned to ours. As artificial intelligence passes human wisdom, it will continue to accelerate on, looking back at us as we look at our pets, and then possibly as we look at insects. The risk is not that artificial intelligence has it in for us, but that it begins to think of us much as we think of the world's insects. We're not out to get insects, but we don't terribly worry if we step on an ant on the way to our business. So ensuring that we get better results out of artificial intelligence, that it gives us the productivity boost without the world-ending risks, has got to be a priority. Right now, if you survey artificial intelligence researchers and ask them what's the chance that it will end humanity, they give you a number that averages out at 5%. That feels to me like too big a risk to be dealing with. So, what can we do about it? First of all, each of those challenges has potential solutions. In the area of climate change, we need to be ensuring that developing countries follow a low carbon path and advanced countries take more steps in order to reduce climate change emissions. In the area of nuclear warfare, it's important to move to a no first use approach and to take nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert. In the area of bioengineered pandemics, we can do more to reduce gain of function research and make sure that the DNA printers that are available aren't able to print bad bugs. In the area of superintelligence, we need to ensure that the next systems obey the principles of being altruistic, observant and humble, so they learn from us about our values and are able to ensure that they evolve to create a better world rather than a scarier world. And cross-cutting all of this is the danger of populism. The number of populist leaders in office has quintupled since the early 1990s. Populists want to turn the temperature up. They want to pull back from intellectual engagement. They're hostile to global institutions. And all of this makes those catastrophic risks more likely because international engagement, thinking with a calm head, and ensuring that we tap the best of expert wisdom is the way in which we're going to be able to deal with these catastrophic risks. Now, all of this can seem pretty negative for a Friday night. I'm not sure you thought that you wanted to come to Melbourne University on a Friday night in order for somebody to tell you about the end of the world. And frankly, if you want to know about the end of the world, there's a whole lot of great disaster movies out there that are going to be much more entertaining than the talk from a politician. But I want to leave you with the notion that thinking about catastrophic risk is ultimately thinking about a beautiful future for humanity. Humanity has only been on the planet in our current form for something around 300,000 years, about 10,000 generations. But before the sun blows up, we have about 1 billion years. That's time for some 30 million generations. So if you think of all of humanity through the span of a human life, the point at which we're at now is just an infant in their first few days. In that time, we've managed to produce some remarkable things. You think about the poetry of Marianne, you think about the paintings of Michelangelo, you think about the art and architecture and about the generosity we're beginning to show to one another. We are a kinder, more enlightened species than we were just a few thousand years ago. Imagine what levels of generosity and of enlightenment we could attain as those generations go on. Imagine how kind we could be to one another and to the non-human animals with which we share a planet. So tackling catastrophic risk isn't just about saving the lives of all of us, although catastrophic risks are more dangerous to each of you than a car crash. It's also about ensuring that the future of humanity and the species with which we share the planet are as wonderful and glorious as they can possibly be. I'm a Stoic, and I'm struck by the values of Stoicism and how they can help us live better lives. Courage, justice, temperance and wisdom are good ways of living your life, but they're also great ways of giving back. Thank you to all of you for taking tonight and this weekend to think about effective altruism. You could not be in a more important conversation. You couldn't be in a more important place in Australia to be having that conversation. Enjoy the intellectual side, and as you do so, make sure that you don't just relish the intellectual arguments. The connections you'll build this weekend are enormously important too. Take time to get to know those you came with well. Take time to meet new people. It's though the effective altruism movement is an intellectual movement. You're all here because you think, I imagine, as utilitarians. But don't just be utility-crunching computers. Make sure you build that human side. You're here for the sake of humanity. Make sure that tonight and this weekend brings out the humanity in all of you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this evening.
Thank you once again, Andrew, Leigh, for coming all the way to Canberra for this. Thank you very much. All right, I promised that I would let Andrew get home for bedtime with those three gorgeous kids of his. So we have three other wonderful panellists who are going to be discussing some of these ideas around existential risk, but other cause areas that we care about and how policy and how working with and alongside people like Andrew is possible. So the first of those guests is Dr. Bidda Jones. Bidda is a member of the Order of Australia for her extensive service to animal welfare. She was at the RSPCA for 25 years as a scientist, then chief scientist, strategy officer, and even a stint as the CEO. And in that time, she established the RSPCA not just as an advocacy organisation, but as a trusted scientific authority. So she's shown, in the same way that we sometimes try to do, an ability to both advocate and to find the answers to hard questions. She played an instrumental role in campaigns to end live animal exports and to reduce the use of battery cages for chickens. She's now the co-founder and director of strategy for the Alliance for Animals, and so she's no chicken when it comes to cracking hard policy issues. Please welcome Dr. Bidda Jones.
Oh, bad puns. I'll see if I can weave a couple into my talk. Look, thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. I was at the Effective Altruism Conference in Canberra last year. It was my first one, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the weekend. So Micheal gave us the challenge of getting you excited about policy change, which is, I think, not that hard to do. But at this moment in time, is that loud enough? Or? Okay. Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. Getting excited about policy change in animal welfare is something that I've been motivating myself to do for about 30 years now, and I'm still doing it. And I thought a cheesy quote might be a way to get us started on this. So this is a Tom Hanks quote, but he didn't actually write it because he said it in a movie. And I just love the idea that just because somebody said something in a movie and then you repeat that quote a number of times, people think it's true. But I'm going to use it anyway because I like the idea that, and I think this is actually quite a good quote for an effective altruism conference, because you're not here because you think what you're trying to do is easy. And I'm still trying to chase the great in terms of the hard things that I've been working on. So, yeah, policy change isn't easy, but the potential benefits are really significant. I've been working, as I said, in animal advocacy for 30 years, and I'm still have a lot of things that we would like to achieve. And it's very hard working in animal welfare policy change, inherently hard, harder than maybe in any other area, because the change that we're trying to effect is about animals and not people. And despite what Toto, who's Australia's first dog, you met Toto before, despite what he might think, she might think, our political system is based on advancing the interests of people, human interests, not the interests of non-human animals. The system is rigged against Toto, and it's rigged against the billions of animals that we farm in Australia for food and fibre. And because commercial industries that use and exploit animals have the most influence in decision making about the welfare of the animals that they're involved in rearing and using, that makes it even harder. So to have any chance of changing this, we've got to persuade decision makers that improving animal welfare is beneficial for society as a whole, and that most Australians support that kind of policy change. But I think we've got a number of reasons to be optimistic now at this point in time. I'm going to just talk you through 4 of those. The first one is that most Australians think animal suffering is as important as human suffering. That's really significant. Earlier this year, the Alliance for Animals commissioned a survey through behaviour to ask Australians about their attitudes towards animal welfare policy. And one of the questions we asked was how much should government policy decisions that affect animal welfare consider whether animals suffer? So optimistically, we found that most Australians think animal suffering is as important as human suffering when making policy decisions. And specifically, 46% said that we should consider whether animals suffer to an equal degree to human suffering. And a further 12% said animal suffering should be considered more than human suffering when making decisions around animal welfare policy. That's a really good reason to be optimistic about animal welfare policy change. Second reason is that millennials are now more influential than boomers when it comes to voting decisions in Australia. So this chart comes from the 2021 census. And you can see at that point in time, 2 years ago, but boomers and millennials were occupying the same proportion. Something's happened since then. 2 years have passed, and because of this relationship that we have with age and mortality, there are fewer boomers. So millennials, you've taken over. You are now more important than any other generational group in Australia. Now that change is only going to be helpful if younger people are more likely to support policy change, and obviously in animal welfare is what we're after. So the third reason for optimism, conservatism is no longer increasing in age with millennials. So this trend over time, the previous generations have tended to become more conservative as they age. Those blue lines going upwards show how strong that trend has been for the silent generation, for boomers and for Gen X. and that's in the UK and the US. So the same trend exists here in Australia. Voters who were born before 1981 have tended to swing to the right as they get older, but so far the opposite is true for millennials. So that red line going down is what has been observed here in Australia too. Millennials are the least conservative generation in recorded history. And why does that matter for animal welfare policy? Well, because in general terms, progressives are more likely to support animal welfare policy change than conservatives. That's something that's particularly true in Australia because when a coalition government comes in, the portfolio for agriculture, the Minister for Agriculture, always comes from the National Party. So it's more pronounced in our system than necessarily in other countries. Animal welfare doesn't need to be a political issue in terms of being right or left, but it is, and significantly because of that issue, that aspect in Australia. Now, most people don't know this, and most people don't think about animal welfare when they vote. So that brings me to the fourth reason for optimism. So younger people, and this comes from the behaviour work survey again, younger people are more aware of animal welfare policies in their voting decisions. So if you look at this chart and just go from the top right down to the bottom left, people getting younger, and look at where the orange line ends. So you've got this trend with younger generations that they're more aware of political parties or candidates' position on animal welfare in an election. And so that trend in terms of awareness is also matched by the same trend in terms of whether you're going to consider animal welfare when you're voting. So the younger you are, the more likely that is to happen. And as I said earlier, not necessarily likely to change as you get older. So 4 different reasons why it's a good time to care about policy change in animal welfare. And the work that we do in the Alliance for Animals is really focusing on this. So these examples are from the Victorian election campaign that we ran. So one of the things that we're doing is securing policy commitments from political parties on animal welfare and then communicating those to voters and trying to influence animal welfare policy at that level going forward. And that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you, Bidda. Thank you very much. So we'll hear from about 5-10 minutes from our other 2 panellists, and then there will be an opportunity for questions. Now, for those of you who have managed to figure out Swap Card, if you click into the event, there's an opportunity to discuss. If you're clicking not into the conference as a whole, but into the specific session, there's a discussion option. And in that, there's either a chance for you to communicate with each other, to ask questions, or occasionally polls. We won't have a poll tonight. But I do want to encourage you, I will do my best when we're facilitating a discussion to try to pick off that list. So either submit your questions or vote on the questions of others, and I will try my best to try to bring them into the discussion when we bring on the other 2 speakers. So I'm going to next introduce Marianne Hanson, who's Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Queensland. Great university out here. And she focuses on nuclear security, arms control, and international law. She's a member of the Australia Asia Pacific Leadership Network and is currently co-chair of ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. ICAN was established here in Melbourne, and it was the only Australian organisation so far to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Marianne received her master's and her doctoral degree from the University of Oxford. And so given all of that, I think you'll agree that Marianne's expertise is the bomb. Please welcome Dr. Marianne Hanson.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and good evening, everybody. It's so wonderful to see you all here, and I'm really struck by what EA is doing and by the fact that so many of you are interested in making that change, because let's be clear, nobody else is going to do it if you don't show that you can do it and that you believe that you can do it, and you absolutely can. So please seize the moment, and really, you know, as I say, I'm very impressed with all the work that has been done so far. Now, as Micheal said, my area of academic research and teaching, but also my passions, and in particular, nuclear weapons, not just controlling them, but abolishing them. I've been involved in this business since 1976, when I first attended my Hiroshima march, and I was living in New Zealand at the time. And I became aware of the horrors of nuclear weapons. Now, thankfully, we haven't seen a nuclear weapon being used in war since 1945, after Nagasaki, of course. But what most people don't seem to realise, you all do, I'm sure you're switched on, but most people out there think the danger has passed, the Cold War has ended, we don't need to worry about anything. We know that that's not true, but we also have to understand that we need to take action to prevent a nuclear weapon from being used in the future, or, at its worst, a nuclear war, which would involve many thousands of nuclear weapons and quite possibly the end of our planet. So, let me just talk about a few things here. Nuclear weapons are terrifying. These are qualitatively different kinds of weapons. They do not discriminate between military and civilian targets. We have still around 12,500 of these weapons in existence. And here's the thing, many of these weapons are in fact hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And while the numbers came down quite a lot after the Cold War, they're still hovering at that very, very dangerous level. And even though the nuclear weapon states, there are 9 of them, have all promised to move to 0 nuclear weapons, they understand that these are horrific weapons, but they're not fulfilling their promise. So here's where you come in, and here's where ICAN comes in. The problems are enormous. We know that even the use of a small number of nuclear weapons, let's say 1% of the 12,500 that are out there, the science, the latest modelling has shown that this would be catastrophic. Not only would it kill 25 to 50 to 90 million people, this 1% of stocks, but that would produce climatic conditions which would result in a nuclear winter for a decade. And the calculations are that up to 2 billion people around the world would die of starvation. So the impacts would not be felt just in the area where nuclear weapons have been used, but in fact would have a devastating effect around the world. And of course, if we entered into full-scale nuclear war, then this is something that could likely obliterate humans, but also other species. And we've heard how important it is to understand that we are part of an ecosystem. We have care and compassion and duty to other life forms on this planet. So nuclear weapons would affect them also. Now, this is an issue which I've looked at some of the things that EA focuses on, right? The scale of the problem. Well, I've talked a little bit about that already. But let's be clear. The fact is that a small number of people in a small number of countries have got the power to wipe out much of this planet. And that's not on. You'll agree, right? There is no way that we could consider that. But here's the other thing. Andrew Leigh talked about the future generations. What are we going to leave to your children, your grandchildren? And unfortunately, the danger today is as high as it has ever been. And not just because of the war in Ukraine, by the way. So many of the nuclear weapons that exist in the US and Russia are on hair trigger alert and can be launched with very, very little warning. So the scale, both in terms of the geographic impact and the temporal impact, is enormous. Is this an intractable issue? People say to me sometimes, well, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. No, you can't. But there are lots of things we can't put back in the bottle that we've managed to regulate or ban or stigmatise to the point where we're fairly confident they won't happen again, or we've taken the steps that we can to try to prevent them from happening again. We can't uninvent the gas chambers that the Nazis used. We can't uninvent chemical weapons or biological weapons. But what we can do, and we do this with nuclear weapons as well, is put in place strong measures, global measures, people power, developing rules and norms about what weapons we would consider to be abhorrent, and then we work hard on making sure that those standards are upheld. Okay, so don't let anybody tell you it can't be done. We've put in a ban against landmines, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and there is now a ban on nuclear weapons, which I'm proud to say, has been partially involved in. So with sufficient will, with activism, this problem can be tackled. Yes, if you step outside this lecture theatre, many people may not be aware of the dangers, but it is quite possible for us to inform and to encourage others to act. So let me say a little bit about what ICAN has done. As Mike noted, ICAN was formed actually here in Melbourne in 2007 by a group of medical people, nurses, doctors, and a few stray academics like myself. In fact, ICAN arose out of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, and I've been working with them for about 20 years. What do? Well, we engage in activities. We have a board. I've been a board member now for a number of years, and I'm currently the co-chair. So I'm absolutely sort of in the thick of things. This is done on a voluntary basis, though we do have some paid staff. Now, we work from the ground up. We contact our local councillors. We make presentations to local government areas around the country. Most recently, I was in Ipswich, just outside of Brisbane last week, making a presentation about these issues. And the idea is that Ipswich, and they seem to be positively inclined, will come on board to sign an appeal which puts pressure on our government to support the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We did the same in Brisbane. Brisbane Council is notoriously conservative. And we had asked them 2 or 3 times before, will you please sign this city's appeal to encourage our government and the whole world to take action on eliminating nuclear weapons? They kept saying no, but we didn't give up. What we did was we went to individual councillors' offices and we spoke to them just on a friendly basis. And then we sent the documentation, we sent references to the amazing amount of science that is out there now. We got a yes from them. 45 local government areas around Australia have now signed up. We've also been very active in speaking to state politicians and to federal parliamentarians. We now have 111 federal parliamentarians who have pledged to work for Australia to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So, ICAN is now an international organisation. It's present in over 100 countries. And that global organisation, with us very active, of course, we managed to work with states in the United Nations to get the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So nuclear weapons are now deemed to be illegal, illegitimate, totally unacceptable. Our other weapons are plenty scary enough. We don't need nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons which, as I've said, are likely to wipe out much of the planet and other species. So we've got the treaty. It entered into force a couple of years ago, and we now need to get more and more states on board. Albanese has promised to sign, but he's holding back. We need to put that kind of pressure on him. So we have his parliamentarians at work. We work with youth organisations, with Rotary clubs, with faith-based organisations, with the unions, with nurses and midwives, with academics, with students, to make them aware of these dangers and to ask them to write the letters, to have an appointment with their local and state and federal parliamentarians and talk about this issue. And so traction is being gained, and there is now a groundswell of support. Approximately 79% of Australians polled have said that they do support Australia joining the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So that's something you can do. Another thing you can do, you have the power. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You have the power. You can ask your bank, you can ask your superannuation institution, what are you doing with regards to your investments? Because now that there is a treaty which prohibits nuclear weapons, which deems them to be illegal, just like chemical weapons, etc., these institutions are acting against the law if they continue to invest in these weapons productions. And so part of ICAN, we have a program called Quit Nukes. And in fact, institutions around the world, financial institutions, are slowly taking action to divest themselves from any investment in the production of nuclear weapons. And that's a really positive thing. And each of you can do that by talking to your bank manager and saying, did you know nuclear weapons are now illegal? Yep, it's only happened in the last couple of years, but you need to change your policy. You need to change your investment strategies. So that's all great. Now, we were absolutely delighted when in 2017, ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And as Micheal has said, this is the first and the only time that an Australian-born organisation has been given a Nobel Peace Prize. And I am really happy to say that I have brought the medal with me tonight. Let me stress that this is not my medal, okay, just by no means. It's the organisation ICAN, which involves many, many hundreds of people now here in Australia and globally. But we like to think of it as the People's Medal, because every one of you, every person out there who's attended a march, who has decided nuclear weapons are abhorrent, we don't need them, we need to do something about eliminating those 12,500, this medal belongs to every one of those people as well. So I do invite you at some point during the session, probably towards the end, feel free to come and have a look at Alfie. We call him Alfie for Alfred Nobel. And he's actually been up with me in Queensland, up to Ipswich last week, but he goes back to the museum here in Melbourne shortly. Thank you for hearing me out, and I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
So poor sucker who has the privilege of following that is Greg Sadler, who is our secretary at Effective Altruism Australia. He also led the development of and really spearheaded the launch of our Environment Fund, which only launched this year, which is our charity dedicated towards tackling climate change as effectively as possible. He spent 15 years in the Australian Public Service, where he held a range of senior positions around catastrophic risks, counter-terrorism and cybersecurity. And he left his role as a ministerial advisor to start Good Ancestors Policy, where he's really trying to translate EA research into policy change at both state and federal levels. But Greg's anything but a one-dimensional bureaucrat. When he's not jumping off political hurdles, he's jumping off downhill drops on his mountain bike. And so he clearly cares more about future generations than he does about his future kneecaps. Please welcome Greg Sadler.
Struggling here, Mike.
Oh. This is the mouse one.
Oops. Okay. Running control. Hello, thank you everyone. Thanks for the introduction, it's very kind. It is very hard to back onto a Nobel Peace Prize, so I apologise that you only get me. I wanted to start off by talking about paths to impact, which I know is sort of deep in the hearts of effective altruists and sort of frames how we think about, members of the community think about how we do good in the world. So this line here shows how we spend our financial capital, right? So there's these organisations, Give Well, Giving What We Can, and Effective Altruism Australia, which are trying to help us use our financial capital to have a big impact on the world's most pressing problems. So I think this has been in our brains since sort of EA 1.0, for want of a better term, and is a very important thing for us to be doing. So there's a second idea that sort of joined the community more recently about our careers as a path to impact. So we've got this career capital. So rather than just our sort of surplus income going to impactful charity, we can talk about something that we can be working on all day, every day in our careers. And maybe that's like a better way or a more impactful way or an additional way to have a path to impact on top of financial donations. So I guess the third idea, and maybe the idea that we're talking about today, is our political capital. How can we spend our political capital to make a difference on these world's most pressing problems? And that's what the speakers we've heard today so far are talking about. The issues that Andrew Leigh was introducing are the kinds of things that we could be impacting. And that's what we're working on here at Good Ancestors Policy. And so perhaps one of the key ideas I'd like you to take away is that it's not just election time is the sort of moment to spend your political capital. This is something that you can be doing throughout the year. There's lots of organisations that are sort of working on these kinds of issues, open government functions throughout the election cycle. There's all kinds of policy windows that we can be engaging with to get change in these topics. So I think if we introduce this as sort of a new thing to be thinking about and a way to impact, it doesn't detract from the other ideas at all. Like this political capital is a separate kind of capital that we're currently just not spending as effectively as we could be, and we can change that. So in an absolute nutshell, what we do at Good Ancestors is we advocate, and by we advocate, I mean we advocate personally, but also we empower you to advocate for high impact policies. So that's referring to the kinds of things that we've heard about, also the issues that Andrew Leigh was referencing. Maybe we'll come back to this in the Q&A, but he mentioned DNA printing. Like I think that there's real room for policy change there in Australia, and it's sort of finding those high impact issues and then empowering Australian leaders, so whether at the federal level or at the state level or even in corporations, to take action on those problems. So I guess there's a how question, right? So how do we achieve this policy change? How do we make these things happen? And so I think there's three elements that can go into this, right? So the first element is evidence-based policy. So this is something that we have on our side, right? So if you were an advocate for some company and you had to advocate for the thing that like happened to be in the profit interest of that company, you're going to have to do some mental gymnastics to find out how you're going to sell that argument. But because we're advocating for the things that are like definitionally sort of bound in this evidence-based policy, because this is what we care about, we've got a massive head start in these policy conversations over others. The second idea is this idea of outside gain. So this is the public pressure and the electoral influence. This is, again, like things that we've heard about today. How can we be raising our voice in the public to say these are issues that we care about? So something that we've done a lot of at Good Ancestors is this idea of responding to solicited consultations. So this is kind of empowering people like those in the room to talk to government in evidence-based ways about the topics that we care about. But there's also other things like generating media, attending protests, signing these petitions to sort of put these ideas in the fore. And then the third thing is this idea of inside game. So this is the one-on-one conversations that you can have with decision makers, senators, MPs, as well as public servants. So I think one of the things that the Ban Advocate Project does so well is it takes you, who could be someone in the outside game, and gets you into that one-on-one meeting with the decision maker, which is like a terrific idea and terrifically impactful. At Good Ancestors, we've had good luck talking to public servants, because it's been my experience that a lot of public servants are much like us. Like, they want evidence-based policies, they care about future generations, and they're capacity constrained, right? They're really busy people with lots of jobs to do. And if we go to them and have meetings and give them evidence and support arguments that they already care about, that can be something that's quite valuable, achieving the goals that they have as well. So what does that mean in practice? So I want to talk briefly about this Disaster Ready Fund. So the very short version is that government has this $5 billion fund to prepare for disasters, but regrettably only has fires, floods and storms in its mind when it thinks about what a disaster looks like. Sort of kind of a narrow spectrum that doesn't include the kinds of catastrophic hazards that Andrew Leigh was talking about before. So by activating communities like this across the country, we were able to persuade government to change the way that the sort of design of that fund worked, so that catastrophic natural disasters were specifically listed inside the design rules for that sort of grant making process. So what that does is it moves from a world where likely none of these risks were going to be addressed by that funding, and it takes us into a world where potentially millions of dollars can flow to those kinds of causes. And like, one of the key points is that campaign wasn't particularly difficult. That was a few weeks of work. It was a bit of traveling around to community groups, preparing some of these arguments, because this was sort of a neglected issue, right? So the two speakers we've heard before are working on some really challenging problems. They've got, ministers who have other positions. They've got geopolitical problems that they're pushing against. But there's all kinds of smaller nudges that exist out there in policy that could have millions of dollars of positive impact, where we're sort of not having to fight the hard fights that our colleagues are fighting. So there's so many opportunities out there, and political groups, much less savvy, much less well-resourced, much less intelligent than us, are achieving their goals in policy all of the time, and we can do it, right? So that's all from me. Thank you.
So just as I get microphones to all of our guests, I realise one of the flaws in our swap card situation is that I realise that most of you don't have Wi-Fi right now, which is unfortunate, but there's plenty of things to discuss. If you were savvy enough to have the conference guide up, I think that should have the Wi-Fi password now. Yeah. But I will. I'll start by picking a few questions off here, and I'll keep an eye on this as the night rolls on. But one of the things that connects all of one of the first questions on here is like a risk that can come up, and Bidda, you sort of referred to this, is when things become polarising, or they become partisan issues. And so you talked about how animal welfare doesn't have to be a partisan issue, but even though sometimes it sort of ends up being that way. Like Greg, that one of the reasons the Disaster Ready Fund thing was reasonably successful is that it sort of wasn't a partisan issue necessarily, like it wasn't so controversial. So how do you sort of create a political will for something in a very partisan environment without sort of turning it into being a sort of a wedge between? I'm sure the same thing sort of applies to as well. So Bidda, I might throw to you, how can you try to do that?
Yeah, look, I think one of the key reforms that we're trying to achieve with the Alliance for Animals is to change the way that animal welfare is dealt with in government. So we can, if we're able to do this, then that will take a bit of the politics out of that decision-making process. So what we're looking at, we currently have a structure in Australia where ministers for agriculture are responsible for animal welfare. So you've got, the easiest way to describe that is that the fox is in charge of the hen house. So we've got ministers who are involved in promoting animal agriculture and agribusiness, and at the same time they're responsible for regulating and setting standards in that sphere. So we can take that, and this is called regulatory capture, we can take that framework, we can dismantle that and take animal welfare decision making, put it into a minister for animal welfare and have it independent of agribusiness, then that depoliticizes the decision making. So that's our approach to it. In the long run, if we achieve that, and we do have support across Australia now in some jurisdictions, New South Wales and federally, ACT, we've got movement towards the idea of having an independent office of animal welfare which would achieve this change. So I think in the long run that would help solve this problem in Australia.
So rather than going from the outside trying to get, Labor to start a fight with the Liberals and Nationals, you're trying to change just the structure within the government so that you're separating kind of conflict of interest.
Absolutely, yeah.
Marianne, what about you? To what extent nuclear weapons become partisan issues, and if so, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's been a really, really interesting journey, because over the past 10 years or so, ICANN and other NGOs around the world have sought successfully to reframe the issue from being one which was previously seen as a security issue, East-West conflict, etc., towards a humanitarian issue. And that really rang a bell with a lot of people. So we had a number of conferences, and the people attending those conferences have been people like lawyers, doctors, the medics are always there, youth groups, environmental groups, animal rights groups, and the focus has been on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And now that discourse is becoming more and more embedded into the conversations that we have, certain conversations that we have with politicians. So it's gone from being a security issue where we all cower under the threat these weapons could be unleashed at any time, to seeing it as a humanitarian challenge. It would be a humanitarian disaster if any nuclear weapon was used. And so looking at it that way and bringing international humanitarian law into the picture has been really useful. Having said that, it's not necessarily always been a left and right thing. You might be surprised to know that even people like Ronald Reagan and Henry Kissinger have actually argued that nuclear weapons must be eliminated. And currently, among politicians around the world, certainly even here in Australia, the parliamentary friends of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, it's a cross-party organisation. We have coalition members, we have a lot of Labor members, Greens, etc. So I think that's really important, to change the way we talk and think about these issues, and that can help.
Greg, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I guess the advantage that my organisation has is because we're happy to work across really many high impact causes, like we can sort of much more easily dodge like those big high challenges. And so I guess like in some ways that means we're never going to achieve those like massive outcomes that is on the table for the other two organisations do, which is terrific, but it means that we can sort of dodge the obstacles that might be hard to solve and find those small wins. So I guess like something that I was thinking about when Julie was talking is he mentioned the ability to print DNA in a way that might empower the production of bioweapons. So the Commonwealth already has a regulatory scheme for the import of printed DNA to Australia, and it just doesn't happen to say that that DNA has to be subject to sort of safety and security screening before it's imported to Australia. And there's just no partisan view on that. In fact, I bet it's an issue that no one in Parliament even knows about. So it feels like that's the kind of issue where we could go to a COVID inquiry and, like, as a community, point out, like, hey, like, there's no set political view on this, but this thing's really risky. There's existing legislation there. Like, you just need to change like one sentence, and that will make a really meaningful difference in the future. And that feels like a kind of easy win. So I suppose I'm playing an easy mode here compared to the others.
But you're sort of saying by focusing on things that don't have mainstream attention and are neglected, then they don't become wedge issues where they become easier to get bipartisan support because there's no one with strong heels in either side at that point.
Yeah, I think that's right. On the way, we were talking about the thing that we have to work against is momentum, right? So when we're having those conversations like the Disaster Ready Fund, there's a sort of a $10+ billion industry built around fighting bushfires. And so if we're saying like, hey, perhaps like a small amount of that should go to catastrophic disasters, I don't think there's anyone who's kind of like politically opposed to that, but there is inertia in where that money is spent.
And I guess like one way of building momentum that all of you sort of like referred to, and Greg, you described it as sort of the inside and the outside game, and Marianne, you talked about the importance of like grassroots, including people like every single person here in the room potentially being like a band advocate. One of the questions asked is like, how do you choose where to prioritise when it comes to those things? Like, I imagine that when it comes to separating animal welfare from agriculture portfolios, that seems more like an inside game kind of thing. But I don't know how you guys decide when you're going to do outside and inside or both.
Yeah, well, I guess I started with the outside game in terms, and most animal welfare organisations in Australia are doing that work. So either they're doing direct care, or they're working on trying to influence change, but they're doing it on more specific issues, and they're not solving the institutional problems, the problems that exist within government that mean that those issues are more likely to arise. And that's the reason why we formed the Alliance for Animals, because we saw that nobody was doing this work. Looking at this long-term structural change in the way that we deal with animal welfare policy. So, I guess from our point of view, we prioritise that in the end, because we could see that all the other problems that we've been dealing with were arising because we didn't have that structural change. It was so important to us. But having said that, the Alliance works with 6 animal welfare organisations in Australia who do that kind of work. And there's sort of 2 parts. My view is in terms of I really like the way you presented that, Greg. All of those things have to happen. I guess my original background as a scientist, I thought evidence-based policy was all you needed. No. I had a bad start because the first thing that I worked on in the animal welfare space, which is in the UK, trying to stop wild-caught non-human primates being used as models for biomedical research. We won that within 2 years, got a ban. And I thought, because we presented evidence, I thought, oh, this is great, I'm going to do this every time. It's not that easy. So you have to have all of these different tactics, and you have to use them in a strategic way, in the right place at the right time. I have this rule, I never rule any tactic out. You just got to figure out when the time is right to use it, and to think about how it's going to fit and all the other tactics that you need to use to change.
Right, so don't be just the outside game organisation, don't be just the inside game. You have to be covering both, and you need to figure out what everyone else in the field is doing. And
it doesn't mean you have to do all of those things. It means you've got to work with the others to do them. And look, in our space, I think it works in most areas. Collaboration with others who are trying to achieve the same outcome is really important. You might have slightly different ways of doing it, but working together, and that's obviously what an alliance is all about. You can do so much more.
Interesting. What about you, Marianne? It seems like you have like what you described was great for us, sort of grassroots. That makes please clear. Yeah, what's the inside going on?
I guess I reiterate the fact that these things need to happen on different levels, ideally. So at that grassroots level, there's stuff that everybody can do. And certainly I would recommend if you jump onto the ICANN website and you sign up to become a ban advocate. We have workshops for ban advocates every couple of months, and we cultivate ideas about what people can do at that grassroots level. At the other end of the level, we're talking directly to governments. We sent a delegation of First Nations people to Canberra last month to talk to politicians about the impacts of nuclear testing on Aboriginal people in Australia. And certainly, we know that that's something that's happened very much in the South Pacific and elsewhere. And then some of us will be attending high-level meetings in New York as observers or advisors, sometimes to government deputations. We have currently 92 out of about 190 odd states which have signed up to this treaty. So we're getting, we've sort of got almost half of the states signed on board. So that kind of work is ongoing. It's not going to be something that will happen overnight. But governments are not likely to sign on to these activities. And Albanese is not likely to sign on, even though it's promised, unless we keep up that grassroots work. And as Bidda said, different people will do different things. So it's a wonderful collaboration. The possibilities are huge.
Yeah, and look, I want to sort of work from, I guess, not grassroots, but from Australian level to an international level. I mean, this sort of most saliently applies to nuclear weapons as a non-nuclear state. Like the majority of the weapons are in the, in the US and Russia. And I mean, Greg, I know that you've done some work on AI safety, governance around that. And we don't have major AI labs here in Australia. So some people's sort of arguments are like, well, if Ipswich Council signs on to the ban, how's that going to help, Putin and, sort of reduce his stockpile? So like, what's the sort of logic behind making changes at a grassroots level over here on our little side of the planet when some of the problems are so international? I don't know what's your thinking.
Yeah, so I guess thinking through that AI window, I think there's two arguments. So the first argument is kind of like a market argument. This is what we were talking about with the bank argument, right? So the idea is there that there's going to be, like Australia's a big economy, there's going to be like significant AI consumers in Australia, whether that's like Australian companies or Australian governments themselves. If Australia has regulation that says we expect the AIs operating in Australia to meet certain safety parameters, then the purchasers in Australia, when they go to the big American labs, will be saying like, hey, here's the box that needs to take in Australian legislation to be able to buy a product from you, and that will help set a norm that will shape the market. So we can use capitalism in a favour. And the second point, I mean, again, what we're working on the other side of the panel is international treaties, right? So there's probably going to be an international treaty on AI, and currently the Australian government has a very kind of pro-economy, ignore safety approach to AI. And I think it's within our power to say, hey government, when you're going to these kinds of negotiations, or even at much smaller levels, right? Like we're on international standards bodies where we decide like how ISO standards should work for various things. If our representatives going into those kinds of negotiations have a writing instruction, think I should be leading in safety considerations at these kinds of levels, then that's a way that Australia can make a difference on the global stage. And then it's like the final point would be just norm setting. There's a whole bunch of examples where stuff that Australia does domestically has a global reach. So cigarette pack packaging is something I've been reading about just for the last few days as an example where we did it domestically, the Council has pushed for that, and that's now trickled out to dozens of countries on most continents. So I think, and norms are super important. So, and Australia has some like cultural capital in the world, and if we're doing something other than just looking
Is that the logic, Marianne, between focusing on the council, not maybe the norm setting, but also the institutions?
I think it's true to say that these things, they're all connected and they rely on on what's happening on the ground to a large extent. I mean, I can remember years and years ago, it was the Bidda group, something BUGAUP. It was Billboard utilising graffiti artists against unhealthy products. And that was to move towards plain packaging. And it was successful. With regard to nuclear weapons, you're right to say that we don't have nuclear weapons, but we consider ourselves, our governments consider ourselves to be under the US nuclear weapons umbrella. And that's a somewhat dangerous thing, because first of all, it makes us a target. We have US bases in Pine Gap and elsewhere, which work to assist the US in nuclear war planning, etc. So one of the things that would have to happen is that if we want our government to sign the ban treaty, we would have to say explicitly, no, we do not want to be under a nuclear umbrella, and we want those technical changes to be made so that we are not seen as being complicit. Now that can be done, and it can be done by retaining the ANZUS alliance. A lot of people apparently think we still should keep the alliance with the US. That's fine. The ANZUS alliance makes no mention of nuclear weapons. We can continue to be an ally of the US, but we explicitly say we want that to be on a conventional weapons basis only. Now, how does that make what we do with Ipswich Council and local groups? What's the connection there? Well, you're quite right. The councils say, well, hang on, these are geostrategic decisions. What's nuclear weapons got to do with us? And we say, well, in fact, nuclear weapons are targeted at civilians. They're targeted at all of us. And if a nuclear weapon strikes your city or region, it's local councils who are going to be responsible for things like burial of corpses, sanitation, restoring infrastructure, etc. So, it's not likely that we're going to get a lot of help. So we need to be prepared. We're the ones going to be affected, and that's why we're the ones who've got to say to our federal politicians, sign that treaty, because we don't want to be put into that position. Now, Albanese has promised to sign. Clearly, the Americans have quite a bit of influence still in Australia, but we argue that it's possible to combine that alliance and to have a fruitful conversation with our alliance partners, which says, okay, look, we understand there are strategic issues, but nuclear weapons are not the answer to these issues. There are plenty of other things we can be doing to foster better strategic relations. Here's the other thing. Australia, being considered an ally of the United States, if we finally do sign this treaty, it's more than likely that a number of other alliance states, Japan, South Korea, NATO states, will also come on board, because right now everyone's holding back as they say, no, we don't. The alliance makes it difficult. But if we do that, I suspect that other states, because the populations in countries like Norway, Belgium, Japan, Italy, etc., are clamouring for their governments to sign this treaty also. So there's something of, an accumulative effect that's really important there.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Bidda, I do want to bring this, get your take on this too, because animal welfare doesn't strike me as like an international kind of agreement sort of issue, but I'm wondering whether there is a precedent even in that space of, welfare policies being sort of internationally contagious.
I think there's two examples I can give. First one is using international influence to try and change policies here in Australia, and we've been working on that in free trade agreements between the UK and Australia and Europe and even Australia. Because animal welfare policies in the UK and EU are much higher than they are here. So actually using that, and my colleague Jed Noetel is very instrumental in terms of getting animal welfare, an animal welfare chapter into those free trade agreements going forward. So that's been a massive step forward in terms of being able to use that. We've been accused of being un-Australian for undermining the, if you like, the status of Australian animal welfare standards by saying they're just not good enough. Here's why, but it's definitely worked. And look, the other major way that animal welfare works internationally is, most of the food that we eat is being sold to us by multinational companies who have got policies that can, again, be better in some countries than others. And just, the work that the animal welfare sector does with corporate campaigns, that is contagious. We can already, just talking to, we can be helpful in that way. A lot of companies in this area really might be working in New Zealand that have their headquarters here in Australia. And, if New Zealand wants to improve animal welfare, we have to help them do that too by pressuring those companies here. So there are definitely aspects there that I'll see in international borders.
So not only can you leverage the high standards in another country by saying, well, you guys should arc up because we're producing lower welfare food and exporting it to you for cheaper, make sure that the standards are higher, but also if corporations are across countries, then you can find where the political appetite is there. And
yeah. I look working with organisations in other countries to just gain that intelligence and say, well, we know, because often commercially you don't know what's possible until somebody does it. And then, bringing that information here and using it to influence policy here is, it's part of it.
So one of the questions sort of struck me that we were having this conversation about some really heavy things like nuclear war. And it wasn't until, Marianne, you mentioned the idea of like corpses piling up that I actually kind of felt something. And I think one of the hard things for us as EAs is that we do try to take evidence-based policy and sort of like make a decision without talking about emotion in it. But it seems like we're sort of operating in an environment where like emotions are driving people's like decisions. And I guess I'm wondering how you guys balance those two competing things where like, nuclear war is a problem because kill 2 billion people, then like that, we talk about like scope neglect, like that we just are so bad at feeling what 2 billion people sort of feels like, and it's the same with mammals, and it's the same with these abstract risks of AI or even disasters, like catastrophic disasters. So like, how do you guys go about both inside and outside game conversations when you're trying to communicate a very like fact-based sort of rational dialogue, but like when we are like, emotional creatures? Yeah, Marianne?
I can kick off. One of the real problems we face is a lack of knowledge amongst the majority of people who don't think that we have nuclear weapons anymore, or who think that the problem ended when the Cold War ended. And also apathy. There's a sense that, there's nothing we can do about it. We're just small people, and this is a big geostrategic competition. And that is a big problem. That's something that we really need to overcome. And there are different ways of doing that, because you can show the evidence. The scientists and climate modelers are showing that evidence. We're trying to get that out to a broader and broader audience. But yes, there is a level of apathy out there. And that suits the nuclear weapon states really well, because that allows them to just get away with doing nothing instead of moving towards zero. So the more pressure we can place on those states, the quicker we can get to zero nuclear weapons. It's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing to do, but you have to keep at it. And it's been shown that if there is attention focused on these issues, we get results. One of the problems is that nuclear weapons have not been used in warfare since 1945. Now that's a blessing rather than a problem. But without without actually seeing the real devastation that a weapon like that can do, the apathy just gets reinforced. We hope that Oppenheimer, the film, might have brought more of those impact stories on board, but it didn't. I don't think it helped us to be aware of the devastating consequences of nuclear weapons. So perhaps we need, a blockbuster film. We need more that will actually look at, here are the bodies that are likely to be piled up. Here are the impacts on water, on food production, on ecosystems.
Allegedly, Armageddon was like really key in setting up the US Space Defense Force. That wasn't that that finding the asteroids became. You didn't want Bruce Willis to have to be the one to say this, right? So, like animal welfare seems like an area where this is deliberately part of the strategy, right? Where like you can show footage of animals in different conditions, but I imagine that can be like a delicate, polarizing, difficult thing to get right. Like, how do you do that how do you connect people to the problem without turning them off and making them feel guilty for their...
Yeah, look, it's a constant challenge. I think the thing about animal welfare, we need to make people care about the issues that we're trying to change, and that's fundamental. And what we know about campaigning is telling stories, connecting people with individuals, whether that's people or non-human animals. That's crucial to getting people to actually have an emotional response, and people do tend to care more when they have that response. So you can't just work on the evidence, look at the science, you can't just explain things in terms of numbers, you've got to be able to use that. And the most powerful way of creating change in animal welfare is to get footage of people doing bad things. And most of the significant changes that I've been involved with have occurred because somebody has obtained footage, often undercover, often illegal. And that ends up being the trigger for actually bringing in a change in policy. You can't just do that. You can't just do the footage. You've got to have a plan behind it. You've got to be able to, this is going back to what I said earlier, you've got to have, you've got to have groups who are able to use that and then have solutions ready to take to government to say, okay, well, you've now seen it. But that sort of approach is it's crucial. And unfortunately, it's getting much harder to do because people are finding it much harder to have access. We've got ag laws in Australia that make it very difficult for anyone to go onto private land and film. And not just that, trespass laws have always been there. We didn't need ag laws for that. But we've also made it much harder in Australia to actually broadcast. Even when footage is considered to be in the public interest, it's much harder now for the ABC to actually show that.
The public doesn't want to see it, or and the pressure from the agricultural want to keep it under wraps. Greg, what about you? So you're focusing on these futurists that hopefully don't happen. How do you make this better?
Yeah, I think authenticity is the thing that I say is most important here, both for myself when I'm talking to politicians or public servants about these ideas, and also if people in this room are engaged, I think engaging with authentic voice is important. But I guess, for me, sometimes I feel emotions in many places. So people who have seen me talking about philanthropy reform will have seen me getting really angry about tax legislation in Australia. I think the fact that my two colleagues don't have tax deductible status for their charities is completely fucking outrageous. An emotional buy. And I think when someone looks at me, that guy really cares about tax policy. I think there's something in that. So I guess let your emotions run free. And if that's about tax policy, I think that's really great.
Look, we're starting to head towards the end here, and I guess one of the core things in the community is trying to prioritise actions and figure out the things that we can most do, that we have the power to do. And I also kind of want, I think this, over the last sort of few years, we've seen that the EA community can make a difference in a lot of these things, and with even without expertise in animals and nuclear weapons, each of us can have a role. So what do you think we should be prioritising each of us sort of muck punters in the community who don't have the same sort of expertise as you to try to help change policy in the area you're talking about. What's the stuff that's worked the best? If you had to give us 2 things to do, what would that be?
Yeah, Greg and I talked about this earlier, so and please come along to the workshop that we're running on Sunday at 11 o'clock if you want to learn about how to do policy policy change in animal welfare in Australia. Look, I think there's actually, we underestimate how powerful individual voices are when we're thinking about how to influence the decision makers. So the people that you vote for actually do care about what you think. They care more about what you think than you would give them credit for. Whether that's at a local council level or it's at your state MP or your federal MP, they don't hear enough from young people. Most of the people that actually bother to go and have a meeting are retired, and I've told you they're dying off now, right? So, you need to be in there, and they're listening. They will listen. If you go in and actually have a meeting, make a phone call, write a letter about an issue that matters to you, then that's really significant. They get bombarded with mass communications now, so personalised communications, evidence-based communications particularly are really, really powerful. So I think that's one thing on an individual level, and then you've got government processes. We're just counting, there are probably 5 different policy, public consultation processes happening in Australia between now and Christmas that will affect animal welfare. And with what Greg did with the Productivity Commission work, it was about DGR status and tax concessions for charities. Probably stealing what you were going to say now, but the effect that the EA community had on that process was really significant. And you guys write great submissions, really good ones, evidence-based submissions that are well argued. So I think empowering you to do that more and just explaining when those opportunities arise, then you know about it. Again, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I guess I have sort of a similar answer. So I think community is important in 2 different ways. So firstly, everyone in this room probably lives in a city that has an EA community group in it. I hadn't gone to a single meeting of my EA community group until a year ago, so I apologise for that. But since going to them, they've been really excellent. So if you haven't yet connected with your EA community group, that's a really good thing to be doing. For people who are running those groups, I know that you've got kind of like a schedule that you're trying to fill, and maybe sometimes you've got too many things on, or sometimes you're looking for things on. But I think that this is a really kind of powerful thing to think about in that tempo of events. Like, discuss the podcast, discuss the reading groups, let's talk about careers. But we can also activate those community groups to actually use them for impact in the world. So I'm not saying that should be every event, but I think it's a great thing to do if you're a community group leader to run those kinds of events, or if you're a person from a community group and you like those events, let your community group leader know that that's something that you find valuable. Because I've run some of those kinds of events, but I'm sure that we could work together to do more of this time. So if that's something that you have appetite for, we're here to help you do that.
Let's go. All right.
Yeah, but one of the things we found really important and successful, so a campaign we ran last year, with the new government coming in, we felt that there was the opportunity to try to get them to change their position, their formal position on even something as simple as the UN vote, the annual vote on whether the ban treaty is a good idea or not. Now, previously, of course, the government had always voted against. Through our ban advocate meetings, we encouraged everybody and their kids and their friends write a letter to the Foreign Minister, to the Prime Minister, saying why you think Australia should change its position. And Australia did. They didn't vote yes, but they abstained. And that was a step which show that, okay, they're not going to be just dictated to by, the nuclear weapons states. So action can be taken by individuals. If it's coordinated, that's great. And I think, as Bidda said, if they hear from you, they will remember that. They will take action. It doesn't need hundreds of thousands of people connecting to them, but it does need some of you. And individual letters, requests for meetings, these are really, really important things.
Yeah, I just want to second that, I guess, with my hat on. I helped Greg run some of the Productivity Commission submissions, and the things that you as a community wrote were exceptional. Like, there were people who attended the event I was at who had an 8-page document with 55 citations in it about why they did this particular thing. And so that paid dividends, right? Greg and I were invited into roundtables of those Productivity Commission events so that we could, contribute the voices that you guys are putting forward. So I think that the actions of every single one of you can help, whether you care about AI governance or disasters or animals or nuclear weapons. So I really think that this year has been a turning point in the Australian community where you guys have been so much more engaged. And I guess I think it shows how exceptional you guys are as a community. So keep up the good work. And I would want to wrap up by thanking our exceptional guests here. So can you please give them a wonderful round of applause? As Bidda mentioned, they're each running workshops over the weekend, so if you want to learn more about anything that any of our guests have said, please attend one of their workshops. Otherwise, if I'm not mistaken, we have refreshments out in the foyer upstairs. Thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful night. I'll see you tomorrow.